Making the situation even worse during World War I was the outbreak of the worst influenza pandemic that the world has ever known. Over the course of 1918 to 1919, influenza broke out at first in the areas of combat. It flourished in the trenches and the miserable and harsh and cold conditions in the trenches, and spread across the countryside of Europe, and then eventually made its way across the Atlantic and into the United States as well. The influenza pandemic ultimately claimed more victims than the war itself. Tens of millions of people around the world were killed in this outbreak of influenza. And it really does make the transition at the end of the war into peacetime even more difficult than it otherwise might have been, as the country is frightened and in some ways kind of stricken into inactivity because so many people were sick and many others were simply frightened to engage in contact with other people, and so they were more inclined to stay isolated or stay home as a result of this. The influenza outbreak of 1918 continues to have ripple effects even today. Those of you who at certain times of year you're reminded to go get your flu shot, and there's a tremendous emphasis in the country on getting that flu shot. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but part of the reason that the medical community is so concerned with influenza is because they look back to this deadly outbreak in 1918, 1919, which could be replicated at any time today. It was a particularly deadly strain of influenza, which obviously and thankfully every year we don't have as deadly a strain as this. But at any time we could have another outbreak along these lines. That's part of why the medical community insists that so many of us get that flu shot every year. So with the assistance of that influx of fresh American troops in 1918, the Allied forces forged ahead to victory, with the final armistice being signed on November 11th, 1918, ending the war. Woodrow Wilson played a key role in the formation of the peace of this war at the end of the war. Wilson, in 1917, announced that he wanted a peace without victors. He talked about not holding any grudges against the Germans. He talked about not worrying about who to blame at the end of the war, or who is going to pay for what. He had a very idealistic vision of the peace at the end of this war. Wilson traveled to France in 1918 to assist the Allied effort in drawing up a specific plan for the peace. And he was greeted as a great hero by the French people. It was Wilson who had sent the American troops, which had contributed to the victory. And so he was cheered as he walked through the streets in France, and this certainly invigorated him. At the same time, he confronted in the negotiating room some very tough and determined leaders of the other Allied nations, British and French leadership in particular. Do you imagine that the French wanted peace without victory? The French, who had seen 4,000 French towns destroyed, the French who had seen their countryside left in ruins, they don't want peace without victors. The French wanted revenge. The French wanted the Germans to have to pay, and the British as well. And they certainly wanted to see that the Germans would not be allowed to ever do anything like this again. And so Wilson is criticized in many ways by historians for his role in this peace process. He has sort of a wide-eyed vision, a very idealistic vision for the peace, which is not necessarily grounded in reality, whereas the other Allied leaders come to the table with very concrete demands. Wilson's plan, which he laid out in a speech before Congress in January of 1918, was known as the 14 points. And you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there a brief list outlining these points if you wish. They, again, were rooted in ideas. Many of them were based on the idea of self-determination. There are a number of different elements that are related to the former colonies and how they were going to be treated by the imperial powers. Again, most of them sort of lofty or idealistic goals. There aren't as many specific concrete things on the map. And when they arrived at the negotiating table, Wilson was confronted with the other Allied leaders who had very specific territorial demands. Here is a map. Here is territory that we want. Here is a dollar amount that we want the Germans to have to pay. And Wilson gradually saw his 14 points being chipped away until he was left with only the 14th point, the creation of an association of nations, which we will talk about shortly. For the most part, the rest of his 14 points were gradually worn down by the other Allied leaders. And so when the war is finally ended by the Treaty of Versailles, what we see is that it is not peace without victors. It is not a sort of generous settlement for the Germans. The other allies held sway, and the Treaty of Versailles, in fact, was incredibly harsh against the Germans. As part of the treaty, the Germans were forced to admit or concede absolute guilt for the war itself. And while I didn't go into great detail, you can look back in your textbook or review the lesson. The outbreak of the war was much more hazy than that. The Germans were no more or less to blame than any of the other powers. The war had been triggered by a series of alliances kind of falling into place on both sides. But having been defeated, the Germans had no choice but to sign this treaty and accept guilt for the war. What that meant also was that the Germans were going to have to pay for the destruction of the war. This went into some negotiation and eventually was settled at the astronomical figure of $33 billion, which is obviously a lot of money even today, but in 1918 dollars, there was no way that the Germans were going to pay for this. And also bear in mind that Germany was itself a war-torn nation, run down, heavily damaged infrastructure, not in place. And so you're looking at a country without the capability to raise this kind of money. We will come back to this point a few times as we go along, certainly when we talk about the Great Depression. This incredible debt that the Germans are going to have to pay. I mean, I think I struggle to come up with a good parallel in the modern setting, but it would be as if someone forced you to assume, let's just say, $100,000 of credit card debt. And you were just going to have to come up with a way to pay for that. Now, I'm not sure how any individual among you might handle that, but it would certainly be a difficult thing, and maybe even an impossible thing for you to ever pay that off. And that's essentially what happened with the German war debt. As it turns out, the Germans finished paying off that debt just a handful of years ago. And again, we'll come back to that later. The last element of the treaty that I want to mention is this idea of the League of Nations, which was that last of the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson was able to cling to. And the League of Nations did make it into the final Treaty of Versailles. We can view this as sort of a precursor to the modern United Nations, a League of Nations. Eventually there will be about 60 of them from around the world, who all are more or less unified in their vision for the world. They won't declare war on each other, they won't attack each other, and in fact they would assist each other if there were ever an attack. This was, again, Wilson's pride and joy. It was the one point that he had clung to and refused to allow it to be eliminated. And so now Woodrow Wilson comes back from helping to create this Treaty of Versailles, comes back to the United States for the process of having the United States approve the treaty. And what we will find is that in many ways it is his own idea of the League of Nations that created great concern in the United States itself. Woodrow Wilson found that many Americans, and in particular many American congressmen and senators in positions of power, were not in support of the League of Nations. He was in some ways surprised and dismayed when this became clear, and yet he also set about with fierce determination to convince the nation that this was the right thing to do and why we needed the League of Nations. And so once again, we see Woodrow Wilson, the professor, the speaker, heading out to try to win over the support of the American people. You see on the right a cartoon indicating this Woodrow Wilson steering this canoe down the rapids, the ratification rapids, to try to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified. What troubled many congressmen most of all was Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant. And that particular article, in essence, guaranteed that all members of the League of Nations would support other members if anyone declared war against one of those nations. In other words, any nation within the League would come to the defense of another nation if they were attacked or if someone declared war against them. So this is sort of a grand alliance among these nations. Many Americans persisted in their view that the United States should remain isolated, should remain neutral, and they were certainly not in favor of anything that sort of entangled them. This goes back to George Washington, who, as part of his final speech, said that the country should avoid entangling alliances. Don't get yourself caught up in something that you don't have to be involved in. And so Article 10 created a great deal of discussion and controversy. And in fact, Congress did not support the League of Nations and the treaty, and it seemed they were not going to accept the Treaty of Versailles. And so in September of 1919, President Wilson embarked on a massive whistle-stop speaking tour to promote the Treaty of Versailles. Again, this is Wilson, the professor, the communicator, the person who wants to win over the will of the American people. He gave 36 speeches in a 23-day period, and so he's out there riding the rails, and he would stop and give a speech, and then he would ride on to the next stop. On that 23rd day, the president had a stroke. He was stricken and disabled for quite a lengthy period. Now, the stroke did not kill him, but it certainly knocked him out for a time. He was not of sound mind for several months, and essentially was unable to lead the country during that time, let alone get out there and give speeches in defense of the League of Nations and the treaty. And so, perhaps cruelly, but it's a reality of politics, while President Wilson was disabled, Congress met to discuss the treaty and in fact voted to reject the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And so it is perhaps ironic that the United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles, which was drawn up and largely written by its own president, Wilson. You might wonder, does that mean that somehow the United States is still at war with Germany? That's not the case. The United States drew up separate peace treaties over the following few years with all of the combatant nations. And so, in fact, we're not still at war. We did sign peace treaties with them, but it was not the Treaty of Versailles. So let's take just a moment to think about the significance of World War I and some of its lasting impact. It certainly cast a long shadow over at least the next 20 years of American history and, in fact, world history. And so we can look at a few things that evolved out of the war in the short term and in the longer term as well. First of all, it might be said that World War I created the groundwork for the Red Scare on the home front, which we'll be talking about in the next chapter. The Red Scare was a fear of communism, and for a brief period in 1919, a time when anyone associated with communism on the home front was kind of rooted out and subjected to questioning and humiliation and perhaps other mechanisms. And we can say that this kind of atmosphere was created directly by the CPI and those World War I efforts that during the war were directed against the Germans. After the war, they're directed against communism and in some ways against the Russians, but it was the same idea of fear and suspicion and kind of rooting out these people within American society. World War I also lays the groundwork for the Great Depression, which of course is a global depression. But in some ways, the Great Depression originates in Germany, which is crippled by that war debt that was forced upon them by the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans couldn't pay it. They were hopelessly in debt, and so their society, by the mid to late 20s, began to sink into a severe depression, in some ways worse even than the American Great Depression. And their debt begins to seep around the globe and have its effects in other European nations and eventually within the United States itself. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the chapter on the Great Depression. And finally, World War I in many ways lays the groundwork for World War II. In fact, there is a school of historians that makes the argument that World Wars I and II are essentially the same war, just with an interlude in between. They really don't recognize the peace established by the Treaty of Versailles, such as it was. But certainly World War I creates the bitterness and the resentment among Germans that would inspire them to begin to launch what becomes World War II. And in particular, a young German lieutenant named Adolf Hitler, who was there at the end of World War I, sickened and embittered by the fact that the Germans were forced to accept guilt for the war and blame for the war. And in fact, Adolf Hitler made it his mission from that point forward to avenge Germany's defeat after World War I.